They called her Australia's golden girl, a shining voice from a generation that grew up watching her smile on national television. From the outside, Debra Byrne seemed to have it all: beauty, talent, and a career that began before most children even knew what fame meant. But what the audience didn't see was the pain hiding beneath the stage makeup and the deep scars forming behind every perfectly delivered note. Debra wasn't just a child star. She was a phenomenon. Chosen for Young Talent Time at just 14, she became one of Australia's most beloved young performers. But while the cameras captured a picture of innocence, her real life was far more complicated, filled with pressures no teenager should ever face. The demands of constant performance, the emotional burden of being a public figure too young to understand it, and the exposure to adult situations in an industry that didn't always protect its brightest stars. As she grew older, so did the shadows surrounding her. The need to cope led her down a path many former child stars have quietly walked: a world of emotional confusion, substance dependence, and internal battles masked by public smiles. In time, Debra herself would speak openly about the cost of early fame, pulling back the curtain on a world that had once idolized her, but never truly listened to her. This isn't just a story about lost potential. It's a story about how early success in the spotlight can come with a quiet price, one that takes years to name and even longer to heal. The story of Debra Byrne is not a cautionary tale. It's a truth, painful, human, and unforgettable. Debra Byrne emerged at a time when Australian television was beginning to shape the national identity, the early 1970s, a decade of cultural transition. It was the era of polyester jumpsuits, catchy pop tunes, and primetime family entertainment. In the middle of it all stood a show that captured the imagination of an entire generation: Young Talent Time. Hosted by Johnny Young, the program was more than a variety show. It was a launchpad for child stars, a wholesome escape that beamed youthful charisma into every living room across the country. Among the rotating cast of bright-eyed performers, Debra stood out immediately. With her golden hair, clear voice, and astonishing stage presence for someone so young, she was adored by both viewers and producers alike. By age 14, she was not only a household name, she was a brand, representing the ideal image of Australian youth: charming, disciplined, and ready to entertain. But fame at that age carries a weight few understand. Behind the carefully crafted smiles and costumes was a teenage girl navigating pressures far beyond her emotional depth. Television demanded consistency, maturity, and a kind of emotional self-control that no adolescent should be forced to master. Debra wasn't simply growing up in public. She was growing up for public consumption. As her fame grew, so did the expectations. She was touring, recording, rehearsing, appearing on talk shows. A full-time career laid upon the shoulders of a young girl still finding her place in the world. Her early stardom came with accolades: TV Week awards, standing ovations, and national recognition. But away from the spotlight, there were cracks forming, the kind that don't show up on magazine covers, the kind that no one dared talk about in 1970s Australia. The entertainment industry then was a boys' club dressed in sequins, charming on the surface, but deeply flawed underneath. Children like Debra were often left to navigate adult spaces without the protections they needed. The lines between performance and reality blurred. Praise and pressure became indistinguishable. And the more successful she became, the more invisible her inner world became to those around her. The industry hailed her as a prodigy. But Debra would later reveal that, even in those early years, her life had begun slipping out of her control. What looked like opportunity was often exploitation in disguise. What looked like glamour was sometimes a mask for isolation. And as her teenage years progressed, the systems meant to support her began to fail her, quietly, consistently, and devastatingly. This is the world Debra Byrne grew up in, one that celebrated her publicly but neglected her privately. A world that gave her microphones and standing ovations, but no space to ask for help. And from this setting, the true story begins, not of a starlet who fell, but of a child who was never given the chance to just be one. In the beginning, Debra Byrne seemed destined for a flawless ascent. Born in Melbourne in 1957, she showed a precocious talent for music and performance from an early age. Her natural charisma and vocal power made her an ideal candidate for Young Talent Time, where she joined the original cast in 1971. The audience fell in love with her almost instantly. She wasn't just performing, she was radiating. Within months, she became one of the most popular members of the group, drawing fan letters by the thousands and earning a place in the hearts of Australian families. Her early success led to a solo career while she was still a teenager. At just 15, she released her debut album She's a Rebel, which charted nationally and further cemented her place as a major young talent. Her voice, both strong and sensitive, carried the weight of someone far older. But even as the industry applauded her maturity, that same expectation became her burden. With every TV appearance, every recording session, Debra was drifting further from childhood and deeper into the adult world that demanded more than just performance. It demanded resilience, emotional labor, and compliance. As her profile rose, so did the hidden strain, the relentless schedule, the demands for perfection, the intense media focus. And then there were the private struggles, ones she couldn't share, not then. Beneath the polished exterior, Debra was struggling with anxiety and confusion. The blurred boundaries of the entertainment world, where admiration could easily cross into emotional control, left lasting wounds. There were relationships with older men, dynamics she would later describe as deeply inappropriate for someone her age, though normalized at the time. These encounters, she would write years later, altered her sense of self and accelerated her descent into darker places. By the time she was in her early 20s, the trajectory that had once seemed so assured began to falter. Offers slowed down. The public moved on to newer faces. Behind the scenes, Debra was becoming increasingly unstable, battling addiction to cope with the trauma and pressure that had long gone unaddressed. She turned to substances not for recreation, but for survival, a numbing agent against the chaos within. Yet even amidst her unraveling, she remained immensely talented. She was cast in musical theater, and her role in Cats in the early 1980s was met with acclaim. Reviewers praised her haunting performance, her emotional depth, and her voice, which remained unbroken despite years of turmoil. But stability was fleeting. Each professional high was followed by a personal low. Substance use, failed relationships, financial hardship. The emotional cost of early fame had followed her into adulthood, like a shadow that never lifted. There were moments of recovery, brief, hopeful intervals where she tried to reclaim her life and identity. She entered rehab, spoke about her battles, and even began writing music again. But the media, once so eager to crown her, now seemed more interested in her collapse. Headlines focused on her struggles, often ignoring the deeper context behind them. To the public, she became a cautionary tale. But to those who truly listened, she was something far more tragic, a woman shaped and shattered by a system that never learned how to protect its brightest stars. Her fall was not sudden. It was a slow erosion, made up of tiny abandonments, quiet betrayals, and a society too unwilling to question the price of its entertainment. Debra Byrne, the prodigy, the sensation, the girl who once stood under the lights and made a nation cheer, had begun to disappear from view. But the story wasn't over, because in the silence that followed, she would find the courage to tell the truth. And when she did, it would be raw, painful, and unforgettable. In 1996, Debra Byrne released her memoir, Not Quite Ripe, and with it, shattered the last remaining illusions about her once glamorous rise. It wasn't a publicity move. It wasn't an attempt at redemption. It was a reckoning. Page after page, she revealed the hidden corners of her life, the ones television never showed and the media never dared to ask about. She wrote with painful clarity about the relationships she was exposed to as a teenager, how powerful men, some much older, had crossed boundaries under the guise of mentorship, leaving her emotionally torn and confused. She described how affection became a form of control, and how she internalized the idea that love and power were intertwined. These were not isolated incidents, but patterns, normalized by the entertainment world of the 1970s, dismissed as part of the business, and endured in silence. Debra also wrote openly about her descent into addiction, how it began as a way to soothe the pain and disorientation that fame had brought. She revealed she had begun using drugs seriously in her 20s, But the seeds of dependency had been planted long before, through years of emotional suppression, performance under pressure, and the quiet, daily trauma of being commodified as a child. Heroin, she said, wasn't just a drug. It was a way to quiet the voices in her head, the ones that asked, "Who are you?" when the audience leaves. One of the most gut-wrenching aspects of her truth was her struggle as a mother. Debra became a single parent while still fighting addiction, and the guilt of raising children while trying to rebuild herself never left her. In her book, she didn't ask for pity, she asked for understanding. She spoke about waking up on floors, singing in dingy clubs to pay rent, and being denied work because producers didn't want to deal with someone difficult. The industry that had once celebrated her now turned its back, branding her unstable, unreliable, and most unforgivable of all, outspoken. But perhaps the darkest revelation wasn't about the drugs, or even the abuse. It was about invisibility. How someone could be adored by millions and yet never truly seen. How a nation could cheer for a girl without ever knowing what she was enduring once the spotlight turned off. "I wasn't ready for fame," she wrote. "I was ready to be loved." The media's reaction to her memoir was mixed. Some outlets praised her honesty and bravery. Others focused, predictably, on the more scandalous details, stripping her story of context and humanity. Interviews followed, often awkward, with interviewers unsure how to balance sympathy and spectacle. But in homes across Australia, her words hit harder than any headline. For many former child stars, survivors, and women silenced by similar experiences, Debra Byrne had done something radical. She had spoken the unspeakable. Her story resonated not just because it was shocking, but because it was familiar to anyone who had ever been told to smile through pain, anyone who had been applauded while suffering, and anyone who had ever tried to reclaim their identity from the fragments left behind by fame. Even today, her truths remain unsettling. They challenge the myth of showbiz as pure magic, revealing the machinery underneath, one that elevates children for entertainment, but often abandons them when the applause fades. In telling her story, Debra Byrne didn't just confront her past. She forced Australia to confront its own. Debra Byrne's story is not simply one of rise and fall. It is a mirror reflecting the darker truths of a system that once held her up as its darling and then disappeared when she fell. As a channel dedicated to unearthing the untold, Aussie Uncovered believes that Debra's story matters not because it is unique, but because it is painfully common, and yet rarely acknowledged with honesty or empathy. We do not see Debra as a tragic figure to be pitied, nor do we view her as a cautionary tale to be whispered about. We see her as a woman who dared to reveal the cost of early fame, not in vague terms, but with names, dates, and raw emotion. In an era where image was everything and silence was survival, she broke the code of complicity, and for that, she paid a steep price. Her courage to speak about inappropriate power dynamics, mental health, addiction, and the loss of childhood in the public eye was not just a personal catharsis, it was a public service. And yet her revelations were never celebrated the way her teenage performances had been. That, too, says something about the culture that raised her, consumed her, and then turned away. Debra's talent was undeniable. Her voice, her presence, her raw ability to move an audience, it was all real. But talent was not enough to shield her from the unrelenting weight of exploitation, expectation, and emotional neglect. While her peers were growing up in privacy, she was growing up on cue, learning that applause could be conditional and affection transactional. This channel believes Debra Byrne represents both a voice that was silenced too early and a voice that finally broke through, one that challenges us to rethink how we treat young performers, particularly girls. In systems built for profit, not protection. Her story should be taught, not buried. It should be examined, not dismissed. And it should force us to ask, how many more voices have we ignored simply because they didn't fit the narrative we wanted? As we look back, we invite you to reflect with us. Were you one of the children who watched her on Young Talent Time, unaware of what she was carrying behind the scenes? Did you read her memoir and feel unsettled by how easily her pain was overlooked? Or are you discovering her story now and wondering how something so heartbreaking remained on the margins for so long? Tell us what you think. Should Debra Byrne be remembered only for her early fame, or for the truth she revealed when no one else would speak? Should we be content celebrating her songs, or should we listen, really listen, to what she's been trying to say all along? At Aussie Uncovered, we believe Debra Byrne is not just a lost voice of the past. She is a survivor. And in telling her story, perhaps we can finally give her, and others like her, the dignity of being heard. Some names fade with time, others haunt it. Debra Byrne remains etched in the memory of a generation, not just for the songs she sang or the stages she graced, but for the silence that echoed long after the music stopped. Her face was once a symbol of joy on Australian television screens, a beacon of youth and possibility. But now, for those who know her story, that same face tells a different kind of tale, one of innocence lost, of truth reclaimed, and of a legacy more complicated than any headline could ever capture. She was a girl who carried the weight of fame before she even understood its meaning. A woman who tried again and again to rise from the wreckage left behind by others' decisions. And though the industry moved on, her story lingers. Not as a tragedy, but as a truth that refuses to be buried. In quiet moments, when the spotlight fades and the room is still, you might remember a lyric she once sang, a performance she gave with every ounce of herself. And now, knowing what she was living through behind that perfect pitch, doesn't it all sound different? Her legacy isn't about the awards she did or didn't win. It's about the questions she forced us to ask, about how we protect our young, how we listen to those in pain, and how we reckon with the parts of our culture we once applauded without question. Some stories are never told, but now you know. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, the young girl in sequins and spotlight, the one who just wanted to be loved for who she was, not who she was told to be, finally feels seen. The story of Debra Byrne, once forgotten, now remembered, not for how she fell, but for how she dared to speak when silence was expected.